and thank you all for your attendance today. As the title suggests, I'd like to go through a quick summary of some exploratory work we'll be doing as part of a larger project. And this project is a project sponsored by Rolls-Royce, where we are seeking to try and understand the effect of constraint on the onset upper shelf temperature. In order to determine the onset upper shelf temperature, we need to understand the relative probabilities of ductile fracture and of cleavage. What we're intending to do is build a virtual testing. So we're attempting to use finite element models to understand the stress states so that we can then make some prediction about what the effect of constraint is on that onset upper shelf temperature. I'd just like to point out that this work has been done using the Euro data set, which sure most of you are familiar with. In the work that I'm going to present, we've focused mainly on the Weibull distribution. This is a fairly general 2 or 3 parameter distribution that underlies the master curve approach. We're specifically in this presentation looking at how the Weibull modulus, which is the shape parameter, changes as we move into the transition region. Just like to point out that with the Weibull modulus of 4, we get this blue cumulative distribution function. And that's what you would expect to see in the master curve, which, as we know, holds well for the lower transition region. The approach that we've taken with the Weibull distribution and our fitting of the Weibull distribution is to use a graphical approach. And the reason that we've done that, I'll discuss more later, but in order to use that graphical method, we need to first somehow linearize the cumulative distribution function, and that can be done by taking the natural log of 1 over 1 minus the probability of failure. When you plot that versus the log of the measured fracture toughness, then you end up with a straight line, hopefully, and you can get the Weibull modulus by looking at the slope of that line. In addition to getting the Weibull modulus, we can also determine what the scaling factor should be using the Onset. But in order to do this, we need to know what the probability of failure is. So we have a set of tests, and we've got measured fracture toughnesses, and we need to somehow estimate what the likelihood of fracture is. The approach that we've taken here is to use median ranking, and specifically we use Bernard's approximation based on available literature sources, which show that a good representation of failure distribution that we're looking at. We've also tried to censor some of the data, and we've compared both uncensored and censored data. For this work here, we're specifically interested in the cleavage component. So we need to somehow account for the fact that not all our tests failed in cleavage. We had some ductile tearing. And the approach we've taken here is to conceptually consider these as being interrupted tests. So hypothetically, if we were able to somehow suppress ductile behaviour at some applied J, we would expect to see cleavage. The fact that we see ductile tearing for that is similar to a run-out in a fatigue test. So we have used a censoring technique that treats them as run-outs and adjusts the ranking of the data and thus the probability of failure that we see. So when we look at the censored modulus and compare it to the uncensored modulus, we see that, as we would expect, when we start to see ductile tearing, which is in this region here, we start to see differences in the Weibull modulus between the censored and the uncensored data, and the censored data has a lower modulus. It's a lower slope on our probability curves. If you think about what that means for distribution, as we reduce the shape factor, we reduce the Weibull modulus, we get a more distributed, dispersed probability function. And this makes sense that we're taking measured values for a ductile test and taking that as a lower bound estimate of what the fraction toughness would be if that would proceed to cleavage. So by doing that, we are spreading out, we're taking the ductile failures and we're in effect increasing the level of J in those tests. And as a result, we see an increase in modulus. We can see that more clearly when we start looking at the bounds of the probability distribution functions. So here you can see the symbols that are filled in the top. These represent the 95th probability of failure. The ones in the bottom are the 5% probability of failure. And the empty circles and squares are the median probability of failure. When we censor the data, we can see that we get a more conservative lower bound estimate, but it's typically close to both the uncensored and the master curve approaches. What is possibly more interest is the fact that the median fraction toughness apparently increases. And this is what we would see in a test. And again, it's simply an artifact because we are spreading out that distribution. The second approach that we took was to use a broken stick fit and a segmented regression type approach. So this kind of, this ties into the graphical approach that we used. We used a graphical method for determining the Weibull modulus because it allows us to gain some insight into the differences in distributions that we're seeing. And we're trying to understand what each of those distributions is by using this idea of broken stick fit, where we can look at multiple slopes, we can see the various distributions, we can start to tease some of these out and try and understand what they represent in terms of the tests. So this is a typical kind of linearized plot that you get, and you can see that we've fit a 3-part broken stick fit into this. What's interesting is that in all of these broken stick fits, we see the first break at about J of 0.2, which again, it's something that we would expect. But what that has led us to believe is that this first distribution that we're seeing here, this relates to pure cleavage. So we haven't reached initiation for ductile crack yet. In all of the cases, we then see a reduction in the Weibull modulus associated with a spreading of our distribution. And this, we believe, is associated with some ductile tearing, which then initiates cleavage. Finally, we have, again, a third distribution at relatively high kJs. These are typically ductile failures, but when we look at higher temperatures, we can start to see that there's actually more detail in this. So we can see here, it appears that we have an additional sort of series of distributions. But on closer inspection, we see that these are tied to the different specimen thicknesses. And this led us to believe that we are seeing effective loss of constraint. And again, this is something that's been pointed out in the literature. So, in order to test that hypothesis, we have carried out the same assessment, but instead of using kJ, we've used a size normalized J, normalized that by the initial ligament length and yield strength. And when we do that, we see that all of this sort of stepped behaviour disappears, and we have a single distribution, which is, as we said, likely to be due to a loss of constraint. What we're aiming to do with this concept of this broken stick fit is to use the idea of competing risks that was discussed by Moscow. And in order to look at what contribution we see from cleavage and what contribution we see from ductile kind of failures. This is a schematic showing how the probability distribution functions would overlay. The locations are, well, the peak locations are based on the Weibull fits that we've carried out, but I would caution that it is only a schematic. We don't know the relative contributions of each of these. And where we see this kind of behaviour here, where this is an overlaying distribution of failure that is associated with that middle region, we think it's probably due to ductile tearing followed by cleavage. It's unreasonable to assume that we will see behaviour out here when we have a ductile failure occurring at lower kJ. So we would think that the relative contribution of this distribution will decrease as we increase temperature. In conclusion, I just want to acknowledge that the Euro fracture data set is actually a really valuable tool set. It's very rich and it's been analysed a number of times, but I think there's still information that can be gleaned from it. Master curve works in the lower transition region, but doesn't work so well in the upper transition region. We're hoping to be able to find some kind of behaviour that we can use to come up with a similar approach in the upper transition region. We've looked at both censoring the data and using a growth stick regression. They both improve predictions, and we see a prominent size effect, which is noted in the literature once we get above -20 degrees. The future of this work is to attempt to use this idea of competing risks. So as I said, we have these probability distribution functions. They are currently schematics and we don't know the relative contribution of each. The difficulty is going to be in understanding what each relative contribution is and whether we should be using a Weibull distribution for all of various steps. We know that a normal distribution will fit a ductile failure better than a Weibull distribution does. So what we are planning on looking at is whether we can use the broken stick regression to partition the data into cleavage failure that we can assess using the Weibull and a ductile which we can assess using a normal distribution. And finally, once we've got something that works with the Euro data set, then to test it on some other data sets to see whether or not we can validate that. And now I'd like to thank you all for your attention.